Hello everyone. Today I would like to talk about what is one of my favorite fantasy novels or historical fiction novels of all time, and that is Taliesin by Stephen R. Lawhead. A special shout out to Bain Publishing that is republishing the Pendragon cycle, of which Taliesin is the first book, because there's a new adaptation of it coming out relatively soon, as well as Stephen R. Lawhead just published a new prequel novel to the Pendragon cycle. This is a series that he wrote the last book in the 90s. He began with Taliesin in the 80s, wrote the last one in the 90s, so it's exciting that he revisited the series with the new prequel novel, which I already have a review up for on this channel, which you can check out. But what is Taliesin about? So it's very normal with Arthurian retellings to not start with Arthur. You need to lay a bit of groundwork first, so many Arthurian retellings will start with Merlin. Taliesin doesn't even do that. The Pendragon cycle doesn't even do that. We go back even farther. Taliesin, the titular character of this novel, is Merlin's father, and we know that basically from the beginning. But we don't even start with Taliesin. We go back even one more generation with Taliesin's father, Elphin. So one of the big themes that Lawhead plays with in this series is the idea of generations, and the way that myths and ideas and stories change over generations, and the way that things develop over large periods of time. So we're starting that off even in this very beginning novel to the series. This is not just about the origins of the Arthur myth, although it is that. This is pre-Arthur. This is sort of like the great-grandfather story to the Arthurian myth. One of the excellent things that Lawhead does with this series, and with this book especially, is this blend of multiple threads of myth that he pulls in to create this grand story, to create this series. Multiple threads of myth and history, and how he threads them together throughout this series. So we'll start with this first book and then give a brief description of what it is about. Taliesin primarily follows three main characters. It follows the character of Caris, who is a princess of Atlantis. Yes, that Atlantis from legend. And in this novel, Lawhead imagines Atlantis to be this almost proto-Greek culture that's set in some unspecified location in the Atlantic Ocean. And Caris, the princess of Atlantis, even from a very young age, becomes enamored with this very specific ritual that the Atlanteans have of bull dancing in a coliseum. So it's sort of what you would think of, bullfighters, except they're dancers, and they dance above the bulls, and they dance in between them, and they dodge them, and it's this very dangerous ritual, but also it's in honor to the Atlantean gods, so it's a very pagan ritual in that sense. It's very glamorous to this young princess. She's very enamored by it. And so throughout this book, we follow this pull towards this entertainer, this almost priestess life that she's drawn towards, but also as she maneuvers the internal court politics of being a princess on this island, needing to support her father and her family, as well as there's this mysterious prophecy of doom that is laid over Atlantis by this weird prophet character that props up very early on in the story. We all know the myth of Atlantis, so we know that Atlantis is doomed, that doom is coming for them, that a destruction event is going to come for them. And so there's that undercurrent of uneasiness that is running all throughout her plot throughout this book. Some of the other characters that we also follow throughout this book, though, is the character of Elphin. So Elphin is a lowly British tribesman on the island of Britain, and as a very young man, he's out gathering from the fishing nets that his tribe has laid out, and he draws out of the water this young baby that he finds floating, wrapped up in animal skins. And this baby is actually Taliesin, the one who will become Merlin's father. So Elphin becomes a surrogate father for Taliesin and has to raise him as a single father for at least part of the story. And Elphin's plot becomes about how he must become a leader and step up and lead the tribe that he is a part of. As Britain's politics and as the political landscape of Britain changes around him, he must lead his group of people into this new world. Now, what's interesting about this is because this is set during the time of when Rome occupied Britain, and actually at the tail end of that. So Rome and the Romans are starting to leave Britain, and then that slow trickle out of the British Isles is beginning to happen. And yet at the same time, members of this mysterious Atlantean civilization begin to arrive on Great Britain. And so Elfin's role becomes how to negotiate the ending of one world and the beginning of another. And eventually, about halfway through the novel or so, we also begin to follow Taliesin, once again, the man who the book is named after, as he becomes a very druidic character and a bard as well, and a prophet who's sort of laying the pathway for the coming of Merlin, who's going to be arguably the central character of the Pendragon cycle going forward. So these three plot threads between Karis, Princess of Atlantis, Elfin, the tribal British leader, and then Taliesin, the druidic bard, and end up intermixing in some pretty cool ways as the novel concludes. So I'm going to talk about some things that I really appreciate about this novel, and then we'll also get into some potential negatives for people. But starting off with the positives, one of the things that I love about this book is how ahead of his time Stephen Lawhead is. If you read a lot of fantasy from the 80s, it feels very sword and sorcery at times. It feels like it's just following in the footsteps of Tolkien and Terry Brooks. And not to say that Tolkien isn't an influence on Lawhead in any ways. There's a couple of very specific ways that Tolkien is an influence on him. But Lawhead is very much doing his own thing in this series, which might sound surprising since it is a riff on the Arthurian retelling, or on the Arthurian stories. But Lawhead does not feel like he's being derivative of, say, David Eddings, Terry Brooks, or the fantasy authors that have gone before him. His writing is very much ahead of its time. His prose is excellent, but in addition to that, one thing that Lawhead does that surprised me when I first read this series, he writes with a very specific emphasis on the female characters in the Arthurian story. I've read many different Arthurian retellings, but this one specifically, unlike many others, places a lot of focus on how much of a role characters like Guinevere, Morgaine, and then Karis, the Princess of Atlantis, who becomes a very central character for the series going forward, the impact that they would have had on the developing nations of Atlantis, Britain, and so on. At a time in the 80s when many very famous fantasy authors are praised but criticized for one thing that hasn't held up too well over time is, well, they didn't write women the best. Lawhead actually goes above and beyond, and not only does he write women very well, as he writes men well, but he actually makes them a focal turning point of the series, but of this book especially. Even though this book is named Taliesin, Karis is much more of a main character for a majority of the novel than Taliesin is. The romance that Karis has with another character in this book is very much reminiscent of Beren and Luthien from the Tolkien mythos. And this is where I say Lawhead is influenced by Tolkien. I don't know if he's directly influenced in this way, but it feels like it to me. But this isn't the common quest narrative influence that many people poured over from the Lord of the Rings stories. What Lawhead does with this is it's the meeting of two people from different worlds, and the Atlanteans become this almost alternate history take on elves. They live much longer. They're seen as being very beautiful, fair of skin. They're often described as like the fairy folk, even though there's nothing inherently supernatural that we can tell about them. Even so, Karis is very much presented as a Luthien-style character in this book. But as I said a second ago, Lawhead's prose and his writing itself is absolutely spectacular. And I'm going to read a portion of the book here, if you'll bear with me. And the part that I'm going to read is this prophet character, his name is Throm, who comes to Atlantis and proclaims its upcoming doom. And here's what Throm says. It says, "The strange man raised his leather-bound staff in the air. The yellow jewel flashed weird fire in the dying light. Hear me, O Atlantis, I'm the speaking trumpet. I'm the waxen tablet. I'm the tongue of the god. Hear, you, all of you," he glanced around him wildly. "You have seen the signs in the sky. You have heard the sounds in the wind and felt the earth tremble with its secret. And you turn to your neighbor and ask what it means." The rusty, cracking voice trailed off again. His hand made a circle in the air and he leaned forward on his staff, as if confiding a secret. The earth is moving, children of the dust. The sky shifts, and the stars stream from their courses. The waters are hungry. Oceanus, my children, is hungry. She is restless. She heaves in her bed. She writhes. The worm eats at her bowels, and she screams. Do you hear? His hand gripped the staff. As if it were strangling a snake, he swung his shaggy head around. Do you hear, Atlantis? The unwilling spectators stared back dumbly. Thramm's words writhed and heaved in her ears, and Karis felt dizzy, as if the stone beneath her feet had lost its solidity. Her fingers found the edge of the stone column, and she held on tight. Thramm I am, and will be. Hero Atlantis, the words of your son, trumpet speaker. Bel's light dies in the west. He held his staff to the red gold sunset glow. And we die with it, children. We die. You, princess. He thrust a finger at Avalek and Belen. Make ready your houses. Make ready your tombs. So, thank you for bearing with me, but that's just a taste of the style of writing that Lawhead has. As you can tell, it's very readable, it's very digestible, but it's written in a very formal and grand style. Once again, almost reminiscent of Tolkien. And that style, in and of itself, evokes a time of long ago, a time long past. It feels like you're reading a story that has been passed down from the annals of history. And even though most historians will say that Arthur is likely just a myth, Lawhead draws in a lot of pieces from actual history and weaves it into this book, as well as, like I said, the myth of Atlantis, but he also weaves in the Taliesin myth as well. So if you do even just a little bit of looking up, you will see that Taliesin was a bard who probably existed, maybe was a druid. And so Lawhead folds that over into the Arthur story as well in some really fascinating ways. So this book really is as though myth enters history, and it covers these different changing times throughout this one period of history. One of the themes that you can see already just from this description is it is about the end of one civilization, that being, the glorious Isle of Atlantis, but also the beginning of a new one, Britain. And then the rest of the series, the rest of the Pendragon cycle, is about what does it take to establish a firm, solid civilization. It doesn't happen in just one generation. It happens over time in countless sacrifices. And this is just the beginning of exploring that theme. But one of the other interesting things that Lawhead really emphasizes in the Pendragon cycle in general, but especially in this first book, is the importance of story, the importance of myth. That we see the world through a story. That what is a nation if not a collective group of people who are united under one overarching story, which is arguably one of the reasons why we see such political disagreements and cultural disagreements in the world today, is because there's a conflict as to what that story should be. And so Lawhead, by telling and beginning the Arthurian story through the eyes of storytellers and bards, and that continues in the next book as Merlin is a bard character as well. This is a story that defines a people, that there's power in the words that a bard says, and even in some ways a greater power than that of which kings have. It's like the line from, I believe it's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, of when you have to choose between history and legend, you print the legend. One of the other things that he does is, and you can hear it in that excerpt that I read, is that he writes with a real depth. Even in this first book, he is planting deep seeds for a foundation that will last for 4, 5, 6 more books, depending on how you count it. And he writes with this sort of depth, with almost a biblical weight behind it. And there are some very specific biblical echoes that Lawhead really draws out of the Arthur story here. So many Arthurian retellings already have biblical themes. Arthur becomes a sort of King David style character. He's almost a messianic figure in some retellings of the story. There's a lot of biblical archetypes that can be found. And in Taliesin, some of the themes that you have is there's a Taliesin can be seen as a Moses figure being drawn out of the water, like we talked about, by his stepfather, Elphin. And Moses from the Bible is drawn from the water, but also with the destruction of Atlantis and the few survivors who remain, is a symbol of the flood narrative. And so Lawhead, even in the beginning of the Pendragon cycle, is saying, look for some of the themes, some of the biblical analogs that I'm going to be playing with in this series. And I think you'll get some extra depth from the series if you pay attention to them. Once again, that's not essential to a reading of it, but I think it provides a bit of extra depth there. There's a couple of potential negatives that people could have with this book that I'll address here. The first is that this is not a book about Arthur. And if you go into the Pendragon cycle thinking that this is a series about King Arthur, and that's often how it's pitched, you might be disappointed. Arthur is a central character. He's a very important character, but this is just the beginning of the cycle. I mean, we don't even have Merlin in this book, so if you're expecting a lot of Arthurian tropes or things like that, you'll have to wait. You'll have to get it in some of the later books. One of the other possible criticisms is that this is not an action-packed book. I find it to be a very gripping and engaging book, but it's not an action story. There's more action in later books, once again, but this is a very deliberately paced book. This is also a book that's told in third-person point of view between several of the main characters, but it's a third-person book. And all the later books in the Pendragon cycle very specifically are written in first-person point of view, so that might be jarring to some people. None of these are really negatives for me, but I bring them up in case it's something that might jar some readers. So guys, I highly recommend that you check out Taliesin. This is one of my favorite fantasy novels, like I said, and I also think it is a fantastic beginning to the Pendragon cycle in general. The Pendragon cycle, over the course of the series, sort of morphs its genre. For the first two books, Taliesin and Merlin, it starts off as very mythic fantasy about bards and druids and legends and myth. And then for the next two books, Arthur and Pendragon, it's very much political fantasy, almost George R.R. Martin style. And then the final book, Grail, is almost like a medieval horror novel, in the sense that it's a very supernatural fantasy novel, like reading The Witcher or Between Two Fires. So this first book, though, Taliesin, sets a great foundation for the series to come, and I really hope that you check it out. And to that effect, I announced earlier on my channel that I am doing a giveaway of this first book, Taliesin. I'll buy a copy for somebody who comments and says that they want to be a part of this giveaway. We had one video announcing it, so some people have entered there, but you're welcome to enter again on this video. If you want dual entries here, we'll definitely accept that. So if you're interested in a copy of Taliesin, this fantastic new edition that Baen has published, just comment below saying that you're interested, and we will consider it. So at some time in the future here, we will pick a winner, and I'll reach out to them, and we'll send them their copy of Taliesin here. So thank you to Baen once again for sending me a copy of Taliesin and giving me an opportunity to share about one of my favorite series. And also thank you to Baen for republishing this. Taliesin's been out of print for a while, as have the other books of the Pendragon cycle. You could only pick them up secondhand or used. Guys, really do check this series out. If you're a fan of T.H. White, if you're a fan of The Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell, you should read this. Though I'll admit, I have not read the Cornwell Arthur books yet, but I need to get to them soon. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about this book. So, guys, definitely give this a read. It's a fantastic opening to the series, and I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you for watching this, guys. Take care.